nerds, what's up? Today I wanted to talk about 4 books or series that I think would be extremely difficult to adapt for various reasons. Now, you'll notice I did not say it was impossible. I honestly don't think anything is impossible to adapt, but I do think these have significant hurdles that you would need to overcome. Now, there's a couple things that I did and didn't consider when I was making this list. The first is I did not consider CGI whatsoever. I feel like we have gotten to a point in our technology that almost anything could be made. Now, some things would require a lot of money that Hollywood might not give to an untested property. Okay, that's fair. But I don't think that's really that interesting to talk about. That's a pretty basic problem for most fantasy adaptations, is the sheer cost that they will require to make well. So you could say that about pretty much any book that hasn't been adapted. So we're ignoring that portion of it for today's video. But a couple other things that I took into consideration, one being how movies are marketed and how they are for general audiences. So that is something I've kept in mind. Now, obviously, as fans, do we wish that all movies were created just for us and exactly how we individually want them? Yes. But the reality is with an adaptation is that it needs to appeal to as broad of an audience as possible. So I did keep that in mind with my book selections, that was a factor. They may be difficult to adapt in a way that is for broad audiences. Another thing I took into consideration is if you would need to change a lot about the story to make it work on screen. So that was kind of another big factor that I thought about. Now, changing something doesn't always mean bad. In fact, I just did a video not too long ago about Blade Runner, which did have significant changes to adapt Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Almost said that wrong. And it is considered one of the most fundamental and influential sci-fi adaptations of all time. So I'm not saying that needing a large change is necessarily bad. It's just something I want to talk about and acknowledge here. So without further ado, we'll get to my 4 difficult fantasy books to adapt after the jump. So the first one I thought of immediately was The Blade itself / The Heroes. So I'm really giving you kind of 2 books for one, maybe even 4 books for one, because The Blade itself is a part of the First Law trilogy. It's fine, this is my video, I can make whatever rules I want. Anyway, Joe Abercrombie. The reason I lumped the First Law trilogy and Heroes kind of together is because they share a significant main problem, which is that for a main character of both books, one of the most important parts of their characterization is the differences between their internal monologue and their outward presenting, audible presenting to everybody else. I'm obviously specifically talking about Glokta in the First Law and Gorst in Heroes. Now, I'm gonna just specifically talk about the First Law just to keep things simple with Glokta, but Glokta's character is so interesting and so hilarious and so bright in that story, specifically because of that dichotomy. And as we mostly know, voiceovers in fantasy or sci-fi movies usually come off cheesy. It's pretty hard to make them work, especially if they're gonna be as numerous as you would need to represent Glokta. There are other characters in the book that this is similar to as well. I think Jezel suffers from this a little bit. He also has kind of an internal monologue that's different from his outward presentation that increases the humor and increases our knowledge of the characters. Again, not insurmountable, but difficult. You would need a very good, solid actor to pull it off. Additionally, as we know with the First Law, the characters come first, the plot comes second, particularly in the first trilogy. I don't think that's actually true of Joe Abercrombie's other books, but I think particularly The Blade itself has less plot. It never bothered me. I know that's a criticism. I don't think it's a bad thing. It doesn't bother me at all, but it is there. So I think an adaptation would also probably have to change some things significantly or borrow from other books to make it more exciting for the average viewer. I think you would need different or more action. Now, from a personal place on adapting the First Law trilogy, I just feel like with those things I said, you might lose so much of what makes Abercrombie's books so excellent. He has such a good blend of humor and grittiness that I think could potentially be lost in the wrong hands. For some reason, his make me more nervous as an adaptation than other series I love for that factor alone. I think with current trends, the impulse might be to lean too much into the darkness and forget the hilarity or the levity or the way that Abercrombie is able to kind of pinpoint some very human experiences in the way he writes about them. That's why I read The First Law. And so I could see a world where the adaptation would not be bad. In fact, it could probably be a very enjoyable, good movie, but would remove some of the heart of what I like about The First Law. Again, that's more of a personal reader thing, and I'm sure some people would share that with me. But for those reasons, I think the First Law trilogy would be difficult. It's why I said, even though Best Served Cold is canonically my least favorite of the First Law series, it makes so much sense for them to adapt. I was like, yes, this is the book to adapt from the First Law at first, because it doesn't suffer from those issues. It has a lot of plot, a very straightforward plot that we've seen a lot in movies, would be very easy to adapt to movies. And all of the characters in that novel, they don't rely as heavily on that internal versus outward monologue. And so I think it would just be much easier to adapt to screen. Next up is one that I know pretty much everyone discusses when it comes to this topic, so it's nothing new, but it is The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Now, a lot of the people discuss CGI when talking about this, and I already said, yes, I know it's gonna take a lot of money. Don't care about that aspect of it. There are some other aspects that I think would be difficult about The Stormlight Archive. First, it would have to be a TV show, in my opinion. Could not be a movie. You would need a season of 8 episodes per book, at least. I would love 10. I'd love 10, but they're not going to give us 10. They're probably going to give us 6. Would love 8. Let's do 8. This is all hypothetical. I don't know why I'm getting into this. One thing I read on Reddit once that has never left my head is they talked about how difficult they think adapting the everyday Spren would be, because they said they couldn't see a way to do that without it being cheesy. And ever since someone said that, I can't help but agree. It would take such a deft hand to make, pain Spren, fear Spren, joy Spren, whatever. All those Spren that bubble up seem non-cheesy and natural. I think that's true. I think it'd be really difficult. Now, you could remove them. I don't think that would be like a huge deal. But when you think of Sanderson's worlds and how bright and interesting they are, it's just how many elements would you have to remove from it so it worked on screen as a live action adaptation. I also obviously think it would just have to be dumbed down a lot character-wise. You would not have the time to develop as many characters as are developed in those books. They are long books. People say Way of Kings in particular is like a slow book. It takes a lot. I mean, when you think of All of Bridge 4, who would you get rid of? It's hard. You want all of those main characters as developed as they are. There's so much going on. Like many high fantasies, that is just a hurdle that would have to be overcome very deftly. Do I think it can be done? Absolutely. Do I think it'd be difficult? Yes. Do I think you would lose some favorite characters? You'd have to. Now, I will say, I thought the Stormlight Archive would be more difficult to adapt into live action before I saw the live action of One Piece. I saw that and thought, man, here is something that feels like it could only be an anime. Now, a lot of people about the Stormlight Archive have said it has to be an anime, so there's a big camp in that. But I fell in love with the One Piece live action, and then I read the manga, and when reading the manga, I was like, there's no way I would have thought that this could have been a live action. I would think it would look too silly. I would say it requires too much CGI. It just wouldn't work. And yet, here we are. They totally nailed it. And I think there are some elements. I mean, obviously One Piece and Stormlight Archive are extremely different, but I think they share elements, the same elements that would make them difficult adaptations, and they overcame it for One Piece. So I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's possible. I think there's a lot to overcome. It's why it's obvious that there are other Sanderson properties that most fans are hoping would be adapted first, just because they'd be so much easier, like Mistborn. Okay, number 3 on this list for me is Malazan. I guess I should say these are in no particular order, because Malazan might be one of the hardest to adapt. Of all these books I'm going to talk about, this one is obvious, right? Malazan is known for being incredibly complicated, and when you're thinking about an average viewer and the medium of TV versus books and what you can do, or even movies, it just would be hard to overcome. Now, I do think in general Gardens of the Moon would be the easiest to adapt, especially to a TV show. I think if you did a little bit more explanation, you simplified the world a little bit, I think for the most part that has a pretty straightforward plot. Actually, you know what I'm thinking about it? Like Dead House Gates has a lot of amazing stuff too that would look great. The biggest hurdle here is you would just have to remove a lot of it. And I think that would be hard for fans. It's always hard, right? I think they would probably, if they adapted, like I'm thinking Dead House Gates, you would take like 1 or 2 of the main stories and that is all you would do. I think people like Tattersall and Whiskey Jack and characters like that, and oh my gosh, I cannot think of the name of the general from Dead House Gates. Oh, I'm gonna get so canceled. One of the most interesting characters. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I can't, it's not coming to me. Those characters would come alive on screen. I think they would have to choose movies that focused mainly on 1 or 2 of those characters. Obviously Quick Ben, my favorite. You would have to focus on a few of those characters. This one's on the list because it would have to be significantly changed. And that's just always hard for fans. I think they'd have to simplify it a lot. I don't actually think the idea of the fact that Malazan randomly goes to different locations and deals with vastly different characters would be a hurdle. I think there's a lot of regular franchises that have the same name but take place in wildly different areas or with different characters. For some reason I was thinking of the Fast and Furious movies, which is a weird example since I've only seen like 2 of them. Aren't there like 15? As far as I know, they don't all have the same characters, right? They're kind of like a franchise under an umbrella. There's a lot like that. So I think Malazan, I've said that word 3 different ways in this video. It's fine. I think that it would have to be sort of like that, where you'd maybe have different stories that are encapsulated under this world, and they wouldn't all have to relate to each other, and you'd make them self-contained, and maybe they would relate in little ways. That's how I would see it being successful, but I think it is just a big hurdle to overcome, knowing it having the reputation of how complicated it is. I also think, again, with the simplification, some of the themes maybe would be lost, which is always a difficult thing when you have a book that is heavy on reread and heavy on theming. So I guess my thing is Malazan could be done if someone was willing to simplify it a lot, take only a few stories from the books, and kind of make a big umbrella. Would that make the fans upset? Very possibly. I just personally don't see really a world where Malazan would work directly lifted from the page just because of how it's written and its storylines. Even in TV show, I don't think there's enough episodes to do it. Just my opinion. And finally, I'm gonna choose a book that is controversial is not the right word. It's not a controversial book. It's just a book that has, what's the word? Split opinions. That's not the word I was looking for, but it's fine. It has often opposed, like people either really love this book or they're just like, what's the point of this book? But I personally loved this book. So this is how you lose the time war. I loved this book. A lot of people don't. This book is because I think the reason I like this book relies a lot on how it's written. It is epistolary, which isn't like a huge problem. I mean, Dracula is epistolary and there have been a million great Dracula adaptations. However, in this case, I feel like the book works because it is letters. Dracula is an interesting story, whether it's told in letters or not. This one, I think, very specifically gets all of its charm out of the fact that it's only written through letters. If you take that part out of it, it is a pretty basic story about 2 people from rival factions falling in love. Like it's a pretty basic story. So if you take out the way it's written, which is why I liked it, and this letter nature, I'm just like not really sure what's left. I mean, I loved that it was a very undefined sort of world, very undefined magic. That is, in my opinion, a very thing of Max Gladstone. I've only read like a couple of his other books, but they all kind of have that unexplainedness. So when it comes down to it, it's like it could be a movie based on vibes, but I'm just not sure why it would be made, if that makes sense. Again, I love this book. That's not a criticism of the book. I just think it's one of those books that fits the format it's in, and I don't really know if it would benefit or gain anything from having an adaptation. You would have to add a lot of story, you would have to add a lot about the world that isn't in the book, so it would change it to a point where it's like, well, okay, you got inspired by it, but I don't really know if this is the story of This Is How You Lose the Time War. Okay, those were my 4 difficult to adapt fantasy books that I like. Obviously, it would be fun to see adaptations. Actually, my really big hot take that I'll just slip in at the end of this video is that I just never need an adaptation. I know people are shocked that I have no problem just not watching a Game of Thrones. They're like, you're obsessed with the series, why won't you watch it? And it's like, I've heard some things, I don't really think I'm gonna like want to watch it. And also like, I just don't need it. I love my books for being books. I love when adaptations get made for the author, because I think that is the way for the author to make bank, and that's a way for an author to reach new audiences. And if I love them, I want that for them. So I want adaptations for my favorite authors more than I really need them or want them for myself. It's just, you know, they're great if we have them. If we don't, I'm also okay with it. Anyway, and also just like, because everyone keeps asking if I've DNF'd Malazan, I haven't. I'm just taking a break. I got really into A Song of Ice and Fire, and I'm a mood reader. I will say talking about it in this video kind of gave me a little of the spark again, so maybe I will start that back up. Those two things are random though. I want to hear your thoughts on any of your favorite fantasy books or sci-fi that you think would be really difficult to adapt and why. I'd love to know if you totally disagree with one of the options I put on this list. You'll notice I only put 4. I really wanted to make it to 5. 5's a nice YouTube number, 5 things. But I really just couldn't come up with them just because I don't really think it's impossible to adapt anything. We've seen you can make it work. So yeah, tell me your thoughts below. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.